Hello everyone. This is now the third of three parts to the lecture on qualitative research. In this lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about how you actually conduct qualitative research, and once you get the data, how you actually analyze it. Alright, so once you've put together your background work to try and bracket the information and figure out what population you're going to be talking to, and once you've also put together your field guide to help you actually conduct these interviews, you would actually start talking to people using your field guide. So when you're doing this, it's really important to make a connection with the person that you'd be talking to. People really won't share very well unless they feel comfortable with you and feel like you're a person who they connect with. Now, something that's really important in having these conversations is also to simply remain neutral in how you respond to what people have to say. So if you have your own opinions about the topic, you can't really let it show. So that can include, say, minor facial expressions that a look of disgust or nodding that might make the person think that you want them to give you certain answers or that they're saying something wrong. These are things that you got to be very careful about in terms of how you talk to somebody. Now, what can also be a challenge when you're actually conducting an interview is actually getting people to really talk to you. And something that you have to do during that process is to really ask your question and then use probes to try and get more information about specific areas that you're interested in. So asking, can you tell me a little more about that in more detail? Or can you explain exactly what that means? I didn't quite understand that. So that's something that you can use to keep people talking and to get information that you need in order to answer the question that you're addressing for your research. Okay, so you have this data that you've collected. Usually you would go in and you'd bring a tape recorder during your interview. So what you need to do next is you actually need to transcribe this interview that you've done. In some cases, this is done by someone who is analyzing the data. Sometimes if you're doing research with a group, people who analyze the data are actually different than the people who are doing the interviews. Sometimes you also hire someone to actually write up the interviews as well. So this is something that very often happens at the same time that interviews are occurring. So you'll be transcribing the information and you'll actually be starting to do analysis as you do each of your interviews. Now, it's really important to actually do this as soon as possible after you do an interview. The problem is that, as you all know, you talk to somebody, and if you try and remember exactly what they were saying that evening, you'll probably be okay. If you want to remember exactly what they're saying 2 weeks from then, you might not really understand exactly what they were trying to get at when they were talking to you, or what their sort of expression was when they were trying to communicate this to you. So it's also really important in this process to write memos that allow you to reflect on what you were hearing from people. So sometimes you'll have the verbal dialogue, but you'll also have other things that you pick up from the person in terms of tone and expression that may be helpful for you in understanding and interpreting the information that you're getting. So the next step that we're going to talk about a little bit more is, now what is coding? Coding is the process of starting to take these interviews and fit them into a scheme which tells you what different themes are coming up in what people are saying. So sometimes you actually have a coding scheme prior to doing the analysis of the data because you're trying to compare it to a previous study, or you had some previous theory that you're working with in assessing this. But it's much more common that someone would actually develop a new coding scheme based upon the data that that is being produced in the study. So this is actually a process. So it will sort of emerge as you read more and more interviews, that you'll see different ideas that pop up, and you can take each comment that someone makes, and you can sort of put it into a different category based upon what types of themes it seems to be representing. So this is actually a really long, time-consuming process. You also find typically that you'll have multiple people coding this information. This isn't always the case, but it's a pretty common practice that more than one person looks at this information and tries to assess the themes, and then they work together to try and see whether or not they agree as to what people are saying in this data, and whether or not certain phrases fit into one category or another category. So what are the nitty-gritty details of how you do this? Well, you'd read the transcript and often write a summary of what's been going on. You could sometimes use computer programs. So if you have a really time-intensive task, my recommendations in this class is always to try and find a computer program that will do as much of the work for you as possible. And there are two common programs, Atlas TI and Vivo. There's another one called Nudist that essentially allows you to take a transcript and assess what the codes would be for each section of a piece of text. You'll be looking for specific words and phrases that are shared across different interviews, and you start comparing between interviews to see what concepts sort of bring those interviews together. What are the themes that are sort of emerging as you looking at it that you can make generalizations about in terms of how people are experiencing this phenomenon that you're interested in. Now, something that I should note here is that there's different theories about how to do qualitative research. Some qualitative researchers actually go into their research study without having done a whole lot of reading of the literature around this question beforehand. Now, this is kind of controversial because you want to read enough literature to know that there's actually a gap there. But the concern about reading too much literature is that you'll actually bias yourself as you're doing these interviews. So for people who've decided to not read a whole lot of literature about this area, sometimes this would be a point at which they would start to really do much more research to try and get more information that would help them to code this information to understand the themes that would be relevant for the participants. So another technique that's sometimes used that I just want to mention briefly here is the idea of triangulation. So this is used both in qualitative and quantitative research, but the idea generally is that it helps sometimes to have multiple sources of information. So if you ask information in one way, sometimes having other types of information can help to clarify a specific question. So sometimes having multiple investigators interviewing people can help to narrow in on a question. Or you might use multiple theories to address a question in a study. Sometimes, in the case of, for example, mixed methods research, you might have used different methodologies for obtaining information. You might even have some sort of quantitative data that you mix into it. Or you might be using both observation and interviews to understand a specific context. And the idea here is by having multiple sources of data, sometimes you can narrow in more accurately to understand the phenomenon that you're looking at. All right. So in closing, I just want to talk a little bit about how you assess whether or not this data is good that's being produced in a qualitative study. Well, there's a number of things that qualitative researchers do to determine whether or not they've really done a good job of assessing people's opinions. Because as a qualitative researcher, it's your job to accurately convey and explain people's experiences or thoughts about patterns, etc., or culture, such that you really accurately present what has been observed in the study. So there's a few different concepts that are used to think about this. One is credibility. And this is really how accurate is this information in terms of truly portraying what people said. So there's a few ways that this can be assessed. One is to actually do the coding and identify themes and then go back to the participants in your study and say, hey, does this actually look like something that's reasonable that is reflected in your experience? The other thing that you can do is you can actually have experts go over your assessment who really understand this area and have them give feedback as to whether it seems like you did a good job. Another thing that you would think about in terms of qualitative research is transferability. So what does the information that you've obtained from your population, so typically qualitative research is uses a small sample size, typically 30 or so people. And the question would be, does this information that you obtain from this specific population, small population, actually really apply to other groups? As you're reading a paper, you'll see in the methods information about that population that should help you to be able to make those comparisons. And this is really important for clinicians or researchers who want to take this information and use it in other contexts. Another question is dependability. So did the researcher actually collect data and make what is essentially an auditable research trail, such that if another researcher was to take their notes and take their information, take their transcription and codes, and to try and reanalyze their data, that one could be confident that another researcher would probably come up with very similar outcomes and interpretations of what that data would mean. So that's the concept of dependability. And sometimes they'll do that. They'll have another researcher come in and do it independently to see whether the themes also emerge in their work. Confirmability is another idea, and this is related to the idea of the possibility of biases by the researcher. So it's not uncommon to see in the methods section a little bit of a discussion about who the researchers actually are and how they attempted to bracket their potential biases. And this can partly be done by having verification by the participants to confirm that there isn't major biases in terms of the interpretation of what they were saying. Fifth is a question of adequacy. So during the study, was there actually enough data collected to have a deep understanding of this area? Was there a deep enough source of information that the true themes and all the themes that one would expect in this context would actually have been revealed? And finally, there's a question of appropriateness. So did the researcher accurately pick a sample that could really address their concerns and interests? So if you're looking at a specific question that really needs purposeless sampling, did they go and find the right people to address this? For example, if you're talking about children with cystic fibrosis, you could talk to the children, but you also probably want to talk to their parents, and you probably also want to talk to their healthcare providers to really get an accurate understanding of what their experience is. So those are some different ways that you can think about analyzing whether qualitative research is actually done carefully and in a way that really accurately portrays the voices of the people that are being spoken to in these studies. All right, so that's closing up for qualitative research in the 3 different sections. So I look forward to talking to you more about this in class.